Karbala is a piece of Jannah. Imam Hussein basically took upon himself the gravest attack from the army of ignorance upon himself in order to shield the mu'mineen, and among them, of course, the Anbiya as well, from that heaviest of attacks, so that in Karbala, through Imam Hussein, God strips himself from his majesty and his beauty to reveal what actually is his essence, which is love. Because the sacrifice of Imam Hussein it's an act of love, first and foremost. The notion of revolution is something that comes up with the 18th century. When you organize an uprising, you don't take your women and children with you. No competent military or political leader would ever do that. And it's a cosmic event that transcends history. It's a cosmic sacrifice. Modern Muslims nowadays, what they do is they take modernity and tradition and then, basically place one upon the other and then read tradition through the lens of modernity. And what it gives, the result of this is a very distorted view of tradition. The entire literature about Imam Hussein is that he is the living embodiment of the yes of the question Alastu bi Rabbikum. Imam Hussein is the embodiment of the yes to that question. And my big reproach to Shariati is that he gave a lot of power to a dynamic of resentment that was already started before him by Sayyid Qutb, and which I think has just been poisonous, because resentment does not build any civilizations. What they do is that the evil that we should be fighting against is being externalized in some sort of external force out there, when actually it's within all of us. We take this one personality of Imam Hussein and we turn into an Islamic Che Guevara. We forget about the other Imams as well. So how are we to expect God to change things for us unless we ourselves make the effort of basically changing our lives? Unless you purge yourself from the evils inside of you, you don't expect to see the evils outside of you to be purged as well.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome again, and today we're interviewing Dr. Francisco Jose Luis from Luxembourg, who's currently talking to us from Baghdad. Welcome and Assalamu alaikum, Doctor.
Wa alaikum salam.
Firstly, I'd like to ask you about Imam Hussein. You have a special theory and understanding about the story, idea of Imam Hussein and sacrifice, and the idea of القربان الإلهي and what happened exactly in Karbala, which is a very deep or spiritual approach to the story of Imam Hussein. So if you can summarize it for us in the beginning.
Yeah, so contrary to what a lot of people perceive nowadays, which is that Imam Hussein is a sort of revolutionary hero, pretty much in the same light as the political heroes of the 20th century, whatever their ideologies may be. Imam Hussein in the pre-modern narrative or pre-modern understanding of things seems to be more of a cosmic sacrificial figure. So the revolutionary political aspect does not seem to be present in the way that people saw him before the onslaught of modernity on the Muslim world. So what seems to be a recurrence is the idea of this cosmic sacrifice, this is Qurban. And one of the big problems that people have nowadays is that and that's a common problem with modernity, not just in the Muslim world, but also in the West as well, is that people do not understand the issue or the notion of sacrifice. So in order to understand that, we need to go to traditions that, you know, have a very strong notion of sacrifice. So the word we use, you know, in the Islamic tradition is the same that is used also in the Jewish tradition. Is basically the idea of Qurban, and Qurban in the Jewish tradition. And of course, Qurban comes from Muqaraba, to come near to get near to someone. And it's the idea of getting closer to God through a specific process. And this specific process consists in getting rid of the old self and, you know, and acquiring a transformed, better or higher self. And the getting rid of the old self is performed ritually through the sacrifice of an animal that symbolizes the old self, and it's you know, it's very clear to see that, you know, the old self being, you know, as the old self, the lower nafs is very often assimilated to an animal. So this is how it's usually presented. And the lower self does not necessarily have to be a negative thing either. I mean, I presented one version, which is the idea of getting rid of the lower self. But you know, for a person who is, you know, who has a, let's say, a holy sort of life, the sacrifice, you know, it doesn't have to be the sacrifice of the lower self, but simply the sacrifice of the old self. Meaning the sacrifice of the old ways of understanding things, and so the lower self does not necessarily, well, the sacrifice of the animal does not necessarily have to be the lower self all the time. It can also be just the old self, but it's the death, it's the ritualized, the theatrical sort of manifestation of the death of the old self and the emerging of this new self. So it's a ritual of renewal as well. So the Jews, I would say that the ancient Hebrews used to practice the you know, sacrifice first in the tabernacle and then, of course, in the temple. And there's a set of rules for this, you know, for the sacrifice. So the sacrifice would have to be enacted by a priest. So a priest is someone whose primary function is to sacrifice. The ground on which the sacrifice takes place has to be pure. The place where it takes place has to be pure, and the sacrificial victim has to be pure as well. So, for example, in the Temple of Jerusalem, the highest form of sacrifice was a white, spotless lamb, around which they would basically tie a red ribbon to mark it out as being the special animal for that type of sacrifice. And the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, would, you know, after the sacrifice, would take the blood of the lamb and sprinkle the walls of the Holy of Holies. And it's on that occasion that, of course, the priest was also allowed to repeat or to pronounce the name of God, the four-lettered name of God that appears in the Bible, in Hebrew tradition. Jewish people don't pronounce it normally. It's actually forbidden. So they replace it by, whenever that name comes up in the Bible, they read it as Adonai or Hashem. So, but on that occasion, that's the one time when the high priest was allowed to pronounce it. So there's a whole, you know, symbolic type of, well, there's a high degree of ritual symbolism around the notion of sacrifice. And we find this symbolism also in Karbala. And the debates as to whether Imam Hussein is a sacrificial victim or a political figure seems to be very much resolved by the sentence of Hadrat Zainab, when she says, when she tells God to accept this sacrifice from us, this Qurban from us. And so this pretty much closes the debate. There's really no debate whether he was a sacrificial victim or a political figure. The debate is pretty much closed. Hadrat Zainab clearly says it's a sacrifice. So how are we to understand, if it's a sacrifice, then of course we have to identify the ritual dimension of it. And what's quite interesting is that we have in the narrative of Imam Hussein, of the figure of Imam Hussein, elements that clearly indicate the sacrificial nature of his life, and actually that's really the purpose of his life. We have the famous narration that tell us that Jibreel brought a red tunic for Imam Hussein when was still a child, and that this red tunic was a reference to the way he would be killed. And of course, the red tunic here is a sort of parallel to the red ribbon that the Lamb would carry in the Temple of Jerusalem. And then we have, of course, the fact that Karbala is hallowed and sacred ground because of the very sheer fact that, according to the narrations of the Ahl Bayt, Karbala is a piece of Jannah, right? What's even more interesting is that Jannah itself was created out of the light of Imam Hussein. So there's a deep cosmic dimension, which is that Jannah is created from the line of Imam Hussein, right, in this sort of Malakuti dimension of Imam Hussein. And then a piece of Jannah becomes Karbala, and it is in Karbala that Imam Hussein gets sacrificed. And we also have, of course, references by the Imams themselves. Imam Rida has a hadith where he clearly states that Imam Hussein was slaughtered like a lamb. So and of course the idea that Imam Hussein is seen as a fulfillment of a specific promise that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made to Ibrahim alayhi salam, when he tells him that we've ransomed him, yani Ismail, through a mighty sacrifice, Dhib al-Azim. And this is really important because, in a sense, it's the idea that Imam Hussein serves as a sacrifice of ransom for the Anbiya, and of course, and in general for the Mu'mineen. Not in the way that it's understood by, for example, Protestant Christianity, that Jesus died for our sins and therefore we're saved, and that's not how it's meant. So there's also this notion that Imam Hussein is the fulfillment of a specific passage in the Quran, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells Ibrahim alayhi salam that he will ransom his son through a mighty sacrifice. And this is, this is huge, because it really puts, normally the tradition does see Imam Hussein as being the fulfillment of this passage of the Quran. And so what it does is that it places Imam Hussein really at a cosmic level, in the sense that he is the sacrifice of ransom for the Anbiya, like Hadar Ismail, and not just the Anbiya, but also the Mu'mineen, but not in the way that, for example, evangelical Christianity sees Jesus, right? Because evangelical Christianity takes on the position of Anselm of Canterbury, who sees Christ. So it's not the same thing as what is said normally in evangelical Christianity, that where evangelical Christians take the theory of Anselm of Canterbury, who states that Christ is a vicarious sacrifice through whom basically we're saved. That in a sense, the fall of Adam provoked God's wrath against humanity, and that Christ takes upon himself the payment for original sin upon himself to save humanity. That is not basically what happens with this notion of cosmic sacrifice with Imam Hussein. It's more the way that, for example, Sayyid Ahmed Badruddin explains it. He's a famous cleric in Beirut who studied in the circles of Sheikh Bahjat. So the way he explains it, and I really like this explanation, is that as we know from the Hadith, there's this cosmic war between the armies of the intellect, of the sacred intellect, and of ignorance, the Jund al-Jahal and the Jund al-Aql, and that Imam Hussein basically took upon himself the gravest attack from the army of ignorance upon himself, in order to shield the mu'mineen, and among them, of course, the Anbiya as well, from that heaviest of attacks, so that people would just have to deal with their own sort of imperfections, instead of just having to also counter the sort of cosmic blow, so to speak. So the idea, it's really that, out of love, and for the islah of the ummah of the Prophet. And the ummah of the Prophet, I mean, some people interpret it as as being what we nowadays understand as being the ummah, like the collectivity of the Muslims. But some people understand it differently, meaning that the ummah of the Prophet is the other prophets, right? So Imam Hussein is seen as someone who, through his sacrifice, enabled Noah to survive the flood, enabled Hadrat Ibrahim to survive the fire of Namrud, and so on and so forth. So that is what it's meant by that. And so in any case, it's that seems to be the notion that transpires from the more traditional accounts, and not so much
holy or holiness and sacredness in its fullest manifestation. If we can.
Yeah, absolutely, and also, of course, because Imam Hussein is also a madhar, a tajalli. So as such, a great artist like Mola Damavandi, in his Kitab Miftah Asrar Husseini, he sees Imam Hussein as the perfect manifestation of both Jalal and Jamal. And so, in a sense, Imam Hussein is a self-disclosure of God. It's it's a bit just like the burning bush, right? It's not God himself, but it is the wajhullah, the face of God, through which God interacts with his creation. And it's basically that in Karbala, through Imam Hussein, God strips himself from his majesty and his beauty to reveal what actually is his essence, which is love. Because the sacrifice of Imam Hussein it's an act of love, first and foremost. And so that seems to be what transpires, and we can clearly see that in popular culture in Iran, because in Iran we have this tradition called taziyeh, which is the sort of theater this religious theater that's normally played during the month of Muharram. People who watch series might be, if people who don't live in Iran might want to check. There's a very beautiful series of 10 episodes called Shab-e Dahom, the 10th night. It's an Iranian series about Tazieh, basically, about this religious theater. But what's really interesting is that the cycle of Tazieh actually starts on the Eid of Eid al-Adha, basically, the Eid of sacrifice. So the Tazieh of the sacrifice of Hadhr Ibrahim and Ismail is being played there, and it's seen as announcing the theme of Karbala. So in popular culture in Iran, that's for centuries, that's how it was played out. So the first great Tazieh of the year was the Tazieh of Eid al-Adha, basically, and that's basically where the enactments of the episode of the sacrifice, what we would call in the West the binding of Ismail alayhi salam, would be played out. But as an announcement and as an explanation for what would happen later during Muharram. And so even at the popular level, people were aware that there was this, the Imam Hussein was tied to this event, in the sacred, in the life of Hadhr Ibrahim alayhi salam.
But from another point of view, or from another perception, can't we say also that Imam Hussein, he was a revolutionist against oppression, and he fought against the oppressing people and against their bad values and vices, and then we can follow his path of jihad and sacrifice and all these very great values?
Well, there's some, I mean, it's an argument, but there's a few issues with that. First of all, the notion of revolution is something that comes up with the 18th century, right? Before the 18th century, we don't have the notion of revolution, and we have to really ask ourselves, what is a revolution? And how do we distinguish a revolution from an uprising? There have always been uprisings, right? Qiyam, there's always existed, but a revolution is something quite different. Conceptually, a revolution is not just an uprising, but an uprising with the aim of completely transforming society and of reversing, because that's what revolutio means, right? It's a turning upside down of the order. In a proper revolution, what happens is that the people who come to power literally change society from top to bottom. So, for example, in the French Revolution, the calendar was changed. For example, instead of having weeks of 7 days, you had weeks of 10 days. The month, the names of the month were completely changed. Even the map of France was changed. So what they divided the entire country into squares, irrespective of the natural boundaries between regions, such as mountains or rivers. That was not taken into account. So the idea of revolution stems really from the time of the so-called Enlightenment, and of course and Freemasonry, which gave birth to these ideas. And it's really the idea of transforming physical reality by the application of, by the implementing of an ideology that seeks to transcend the physical. And this is what a revolution really is about. And it's, of course, as well, the cutting, because revolution and modernity could go hand in hand, because both are, they're just aspects of the same phenomenon. It's the idea of cutting the human being from his celestial roots. So in the American Revolution, it was the idea of cutting ties with the king, right? In France, this happened through the ritual murder of Louis XVI. And again, we have to, and in a sense, the death of Louis XVI is a sort of, how to put it? It's really, it has a very deep religious significance, because when they killed Louis XVI, they took the blood of Louis XVI and basically sprinkled it on the people as a mimicking of the sprinkling of holy water during the beginning of the Mass. It had a very deep ritual aspect, but in an inverted way, almost if one takes a traditionalist perspective, in a sort of satanic way. So the problem is revolution. The revolutions. I mean, the very notion of revolution is really at odds with any understanding of sacred tradition.
Mm-hmm. But I didn't understand why we can't call the uprising of Imam Hussein a revolution. So what's the contradiction here?
Well, first of all, because it's
Nahda, or we say in Arabic Sahwa or Nahda or Qiyam or something. But what's the issue?
Well, because first of all, the revolution is an 18th century invention of the Enlightenment, and so applying it to Karbala is anachronistic. I mean, it's like it's using a 18th century Western concept to talk about something that happened in the very first century of Islam, and it just doesn't work. These are very, very different concepts altogether, first of all. Secondly, there's the fact that one really has to ask oneself if this was really a political move, or if there is any real political dimension to the whole thing, in a sense that when you organize an uprising, you don't take your women and children with you. No competent military or political leader would ever do that. So that's from the very start. The very nature of the events and the circumstances just contradict the idea of an uprising. If we're going to be very clear about it, let's from a factual perspective, this is the cruel and extremely brutal death of a member of the Meccan aristocracy, whose grandfather was the founder of a religion, who traveled at the behest of some of his followers in Kufa from Mecca to Kufa, and on the way was intercepted by the troops of the then Caliph and was brutally massacred with him and close members of his family. So this is how, if we have to look at the facts, that's what it is. And it really begs the question as to whether the event is can even be seen as a revolution, because as I said, if you're performing if you're staging a revolutionary uprising, you don't take your women and children with you. I mean, some people do,
so
but
how can you define if you want to define what happened? How can you define it?
Well, from a theological perspective, it's the fulfillment of it's a fulfillment of a specific ayah of the Quran, and it's a cosmic event that transcends history. It's a cosmic sacrifice, and of course the political political situation was just a pretext for the fulfillment of this, because we know fully well from the narrations that Imam Hussein was fully aware that he would die in this specific way, right? So if that's the case, it's very difficult to define this as a revolution.
Can we also add that cosmic what you call it, the cosmic sacrifice?
Sacrifice, yeah.
Yeah, it has many levels and many manifestations. One of these manifestations will show in the life of the political and the social life and the historical era. And that way we can talk of many advantages and benefits that the Bani Umayyah, after several years they were down, and other things that happened in the society, and other uprisings that happened, and wal ummah wa'ayat, and all these stuff that we say. So
yeah, I mean that's one way that people have taken it. And again, it goes back to this idea of the modern revolutionary hero. And here's the thing, right? If we really are going to be honest, if Karbala was a revolution, then it fails. And it's very tempting, and we've heard it many times. It's the idea of like, Imam Hussein meant very well. He tried to stage a revolution, but he failed. But we, modern people, we're going to finish the job. And I mean, some people would say that this reeks of absolute arrogance, right? And it's also the idea, it's this very Marxist idea that, you know, you change humanity by changing the socio-economic structure of society. But anyone who's read the Gulag Archipelago,
we can see that his goal is to save Islam, and Islam was saved, and Islam stayed. So his main goal was saving Islam, and Islam stayed. So we can say that he achieved his goal. His goal wasn't to it wasn't لم يكن هدفه أن ينتصر انتصارا عسكريا على جيش العدو لنقول أنه فشل أو خسر. كان هدفه أن يحفظ الإسلام من الاندثار وقد حفظ الإسلام. So we can
I mean, from that point of view, yes. But then we have to speak about an ethical and civilizational idea rather than basically a purely political one, because you know, and even so, we have to be very careful, because you know, well, yes, Imam Hussein saved Islam, but then what have we done with it? That's the other question as well, because I mean, if we take Islam as a civilization, you know, we have, I mean, it's not dead, but we really have some introspective work to do. And of course, Islam cannot die as long as the Imam is present in this world, even in the state of ghaiba. But we really have to ask ourselves some very honest and difficult questions about what we've done with it.
So we go back to the idea of the Qurban. So all what you're saying, that the idea of the Qurban is a very deep and strong idea.
Yeah, because through that idea, we have to ask other questions about the worldview that we have nowadays. And as I mean, one of the great students of Alamat Tabatabai was Dariush Shaigan. Dariush Shaigan wrote this really good book. The English title is Cultural Schizophrenia. The original French title was Le Regard Mutilé, the mutilated sight. And it's the idea that modern Muslims nowadays, what they do is they take modernity and tradition and then, you know, basically place one upon the other and then read tradition through the lens of modernity. And what it gives, the result of it is a very distorted view of tradition. And this distorted view of tradition creates the mess we're in at the moment, where it becomes really difficult to understand a great deal of notions. For example, 2 weeks ago, I gave a speech in a university here in Baghdad about the Alam al-Mithal. And first of all, it was the first time that they had such a lecture given to them about this notion. And secondly, a lot of people could simply not comprehend what it was. And so what this shows is that people through, people who were raised in the valleys of modernity have adopted a worldview that is really at odds with the traditional worldview, the understanding of the cosmos of Islamic tradition. And then how can you understand the Islamic tradition if you don't even know about this worldview and you don't share its cosmology? It's really, and that's why I think it's important to really ask these questions and to reflect upon the circumstances, because it doesn't just affect theological issues; it affects actually our entire way of life. The ideals that.
In this context, I'd like to ask you also about another topic which is related, and how you analyze the theories of Dr. Ali Shariati in relation to his understanding of A'imma or Imam Hussein or the revolution of Karbala. He has a book called Al-Hussein Warith Adam, or Al-Imam Ali fi Mahanihi Thalath. So what's your idea about his analysis of Ahl al-Bayt, and what's the negative sides or the positive sides that you find in his theories?
Yeah, well, so Ali Shariati studied in Paris at the time where Marxism and existentialism were extremely popular. And so he inherited that. And he did exactly what the liberation theologians of Latin America did, which is that he reread the Islamic tradition through the lens of Marxism. And there are huge problems with doing that, in a sense that Marxism is a very reductionist view of the world that sees history as the struggle between the classes, between the exploited and the exploiters. And what it does is that it posits the idea that the ones who are at the receiving end of economic exploitation are oppressed and are somehow holy, right? And when you take that sort of narrative, which is very divisive and really goes against, really goes against a traditional understanding of things, then one encounters really unsolvable problems here, because first of all, every social class has its own vices and sins, and the problem is that the vision of Shariati, which is very similar to George Orwell in his sort of sanctification of the working class, is that it's the idea that, well, the working class are being oppressed by the upper classes, therefore they're victims, therefore they're the good people. Well, I mean, I don't like economic exploitation more than, I don't like it. But does being at the receiving end of economic exploitation make you holy? Or we have to really ask ourselves, like, I mean, if we're not creating an idol out of the working class, and of course, after the crimes of communism were discovered, this Marxist ideal sort of mutated in the identity politics that we have nowadays. So instead of it just being the working class, it's it's the colonized world versus the West. It's sexual minorities versus heterosexuals, and so on and so forth. And what it does, it just creates this dynamic of resentments, of perpetual resentments, whereby You don't have to actually do anything good. All that you need to do in order to be holy, so to speak, is to say, I'm a victim, therefore I'm holy. And all you need is to create a perpetual enemy who you perceive as an oppressor.
No, but Doctor, one may argue here, and let me say it in Arabic, like if you study the Sirah of Imam Ali, or even the personality of Abu Dharr al-Ghifari,
Yeah.
You will discover that they are people who fought for poor people, وكانوا يدافعون عن المستضعفين والمحرومين والمضطهدين والفقراء، ويحملون راية إقامة العدالة والقضاء على الطبقية في المجتمع. So a part of it, like you can find some different clerics also in the modern era, or even 200 or 300 years ago, which were talking in a context which is similar to Shari'ati's ideas.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. So this is where one needs to be careful.
And it's not only they are sacred because they are poor, they are sacred because they are oppressed. No,
I think
it's the holiness of implementing justice in the society. The holiness of after implementing justice, then we can implement a society which can live spirituality and ethics and morality. So
the big
overall idea.
The big difference between, on the one hand, the sort of Marxist rereading of history, and then the attitude of someone like, Imam Ali, was that Imam Ali was the embodiment for Futuwah. And Futuwah sees work as sacred. And there's a sacralization of the very idea of work that's extremely important. And with the sacralization of the work comes the sacredness of the rights of the worker. So this is not so much fighting against the oppressors, but fighting for the people who work honestly, with their skills. There's a huge difference here, because the Imams did not. The motivation was not resentment. The motivation was the implementation of a sacred celestial dimension to the work of man, and that's the huge difference here, right? And the big reproach that one can give to someone like Ali Shariati is this complete lack of defense of basically this sort of traditional and sacred understanding of the sacredness of work. And behind it, of course, it's also that what kind of society do we want? And these questions are not, what is the finality of our lives? And this is what I think is really missing, is that in Shariati's work, there's a lot of resentment. There's a, Imam Hussein is the one who says no. That's not what our tradition says. Actually, the entire literature about Imam Hussein is that he is the living embodiment of the yes of the question Allah bi Rabbikum. Imam Hussein is the embodiment of the yes to that question. So there's a problem here. It's like, Mother Teresa said, I will never go to a demonstration against war, but I will always go to a demonstration for peace. Right? It's a huge difference of perspective here. And my big reproach to Shariati is that he gave a lot of power to a dynamic of resentment that was already, that was already started before him by Sayyid Qutb, and which I think has just been poisonous, because resentment does not build any civilizations. And I'll give you an example. The example I always give to for example, when I go to Iran and I have these conversations.
It builds ideologies and dogmatic views. This is what you mean?
Yeah, and first of all, and secondly, it doesn't help. And I'll give you the example. I mean, the example always quote is Japan in 1945 was a country that had been literally carpet bombed into nothingness by the Americans. I mean, all the major Japanese cities had been phosphor bombed to a point that is unimaginable, and plus we had 2 atomic bombs. I mean, Japan was on the brink of annihilation. But instead of being resentful, they just decided to move forward, and they built upon the very best values that they had, which they inherited from Neo-Confucianism and Zen Buddhism. And in less than 10 years, they were back on their feet. And so instead of going on about the West is evil, la la li, la la la, because they knew that more than anyone else. When you get 2 atomic bombs thrown on you, and your own children become shadows on the walls of your cities, you know that they're evil. So okay, we know they're evil, but how do we move on? And I think, I'm not saying that Japan is a perfect, it's a perfect country. Japan has its own, problems, but it's quite admirable. Within, less than 10 years, they were back on their feet and were able to, rebuild their lives without this whole resentment. And my problem I have with Shariati and Sayyid Qutb is what I see on a daily basis in the place that I live. As this perpetual resentment and this use of this imaginary enemy as the source of all problems, which basically takes away any responsibility to basically act and change our own lives. And as Solzhenitsyn said in the Gulag Archipelago, it's really foolish to exteriorize evil and identify a person or even a place or a country with specific evil. The line between good and evil, is written across all of us. And if you want to enact change in society, you enact it first of all in your own life, And I mean, that is...
Here one can argue that also the ideas of Qutb and Shariati and all these العلماء النهضويين or الإصلاحيين والثوريين, they were talking about embodying and living the values and virtues of Islam and of أهل البيت. يعني إحياء المجتمع من ناحية العزة، الكرامة، الصبر، التضحية، الجهاد، خدمة الفقراء، أن يعيش الناس هذه القيم ويحيوها وأن لا يبقوا على الأطلال. تماما في المثال الذي مثلته في اليابان كما قامت بعد الحرب العالمية، لم يركنوا إلى الكسل والخمول والضعف والجبن وأن يلعنوا ما حصل بهم، لا، قاموا مباشرة للبناء وللإحياء ولأن يعيشوا مرة أخرى. فهذا التحليل يريد أن يقول أمثال هؤلاء العلماء أعادوا إحياء الروح وضخ الروح من خلال جعل كربلاء قدوة وأسوة ومثال ونموذج يغذي هذه القيم المعنوية في المجتمع. So, do you agree with this perception also?
No, I think I'm a very simple person, and my big reproach to people like Sayyid Qutb and Shariati is simply this. I'm going to put it very, very bluntly. What clothes were they wearing?
The religious, the Islamic, you mean?
In terms of like what clothes did Shariati and Qutb wear on a daily basis?
You mean okay, not traditional Islamic clothes.
Yeah.
Modern clothes.
They were wearing Western clothes.
Mm-hmm. But I'm not discussing about Qutb or Shariati or two figures. I'm discussing because there's a wide range of scholars in the Sunni world and the Shia world who present or believe in such ideas or in similar ideas. So I'm talking about the school.
Yeah, but again, we go back to this problem, which is that if you want to take inspiration, I mean, all of the Imams fought against injustice. not just Imam Hussein, all of them. So here's the thing, is that we take this one personality of Imam Hussein and we turn into an Islamic Che Guevara. We forget about the other Imams as well. I mean, and they weren't just all, you know, people fighting on the battlefield, right? And this is the big reproach as well that I've done, that you know, to make the Sharia is like, okay, you take this one Imam and then you make them the symbol of the fight against oppression. Okay, what about Imam Jawad? What about Imam Hassan? What, I mean, and then first of all, what is oppression? So very recently I spoke to this person from Mexico. It's like, oh, but the Mexican Revolution gave rights to the workers. Yes, but it also gave them secularism. So oppression, what are we talking about? Are we talking about economic oppression? Are we talking about spiritual oppression? What are we talking about?
But then they would reply that all Imams fought against oppression in different, but they took different tactics. And it's not only the idea of battlefield. There is the battlefield in ideas, battlefield in
yeah, of course.
So it's different levels.
But the problem is this: is that most of these authors, when they speak about injustice, they talk about a Marxist understanding of economic of the economic process being an injustice per se, and that's it's a very sort of, you know, very minute.
Do you believe also because Shariati lacked the Sufi or the mystical or the very deep spiritual understanding of religion, and this why it so what do you think?
Absolutely, and absolutely, because the thing is this. I mean, when, how to put it, Allah Subhanahu wa Taala says it very clearly in the Quran. You know, like He will change the fate of nations if their hearts change. Right? So, and that cannot be, I mean, you know, no amount of, you know, socialist revolutionary can change the hearts. It's you know, the change that, you know, changing your own heart, it's your own responsibility, and it's first of all a spiritual endeavor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And not understanding this is, I think, really shows that he actually did not understand what the sacred tradition of the Ahlul Bayt really is about, and that's a fatal mistake. This is not just some side thing. It's a fatal mistake that basically you know, Shariati had in his worldview. Mm-hmm. It's without. I mean, I'll give you an example for that. So the great Japanese Zen master Dogen lived in a time where Japan was torn apart by a terrible civil war. But what did he do? He understood that nothing would change unless people's heart changed. So what he went about to do was to teach meditation, not just to monks, but lay people. So farmers, blacksmiths, samurais, merchants, housewives. He taught it to everyone, and he brought about in the long run, him and his religious order really contributed to actually change things in Japan in the long run. And again, I'm not saying Japan is a bed of roses. I'm not saying that. There are deep problems in Japan, but it helps. You know, it really helps. You know, the situation. And I mean, I'm going to tell you from my from where I live. I live in Iraq at the moment. I know someone who's an electrician here, and who tells me that there's not a single week where he doesn't work at someone's house and he doesn't find some sort of black magic talisman in the walls. There's sihr everywhere in this society. So no amount of revolution will change anything as long as people have not removed these spiritual diseases from their lives. because you can unless people change, right? I mean, and we see it from other things, like the way that animals are treated, like dogs and cats, how they're being treated. There was a time in the 19th century where the Ottoman Empire was seen as a role model in terms of the way that cats and dogs were being treated. Now, in Muslim countries, these animals are, I mean, there's not a week where I don't hear of people torturing cats and stuff like that. This is unheard of in the Muslim world. We never had this before, right? So how are we to expect God to change things for us unless we ourselves make the effort of basically changing our lives? And this is where the danger of people like Qutb and Shariati and all these other thinkers, it's very blatant, because what they do is that the evil that we should be fighting against is being externalized in some sort of external force out there, when actually it's within all of us. And yes, you should fight for social justice. In a sense, you should fight for the rights of the workers, and that's really important. But whilst you're doing that, you should also, do jihad min nafs. And that's the obligatory one. That's the obligatory jihad that precedes everything else. Unless you purge yourself from the evils inside of you, you don't expect to see the evils outside of you to be purged as well.